This sterile, pristine 3D grid represents a persistent professional ideal, architecture as a purely objective, rational exercise executed on a blank site. Within this framework, designers evaluate buildings through the narrow lenses of aesthetic coherence or technical performance, such as energy efficiency metrics. But the isolated building is a fiction. Every structure is a node in a massive web of carbon emission pipelines, heat island radiation zones, and global material extraction routes. These pipelines often terminate in specific human communities, directly contributing to neighborhood displacement and socioeconomic exclusion. Space is never neutral. A floor plan is not a blank canvas. It is an arrangement of historical assumptions and power dynamics. To practice architecture without theoretical awareness is to unconsciously reproduce inherited political and ecological harm. To address the overlapping crises of the built environment, we must dissect the historical epistemologies that constructed the illusion of neutral space. The roots of this illusion reach back to the Renaissance, when architecture was codified as a mathematical discipline derived from classical antiquity. This anatomical diagram illustrates the origin of that logic, the universal human. The proportions of this specific male figure dictated the geometric boundaries of the circles and squares used to define ideal space. The 20th century modernist movement adapted this anthropocentric obsession to meet the demands of the industrial age. Modernism introduced the machine for living in, a paradigm prioritizing mass production and absolute abstraction. Buildings like the Villa Savoy, elevated on columns, established a physical detachment from the local landscape. In this era, the architect acted as the supreme arbiter of a universal standard, commanding the spatial arrangement from a godlike perspective. This logic materialized in massive public housing blocks and rigid urban zoning. The Unité d'habitation imposed identical cellular units onto thousands of residents, treating the population as a series of interchangeable data points. But this universalism was exclusionary. The default user was implicitly male, able-bodied, and economically normative. By designing for that narrow demographic, the modernist plan erased the gendered realities of domestic labor, mobility, safety, and caregiving. This model also detached architecture from environmental reality, relying on fossil fuels to heat and cool identical glass boxes, regardless of the local climate. The universal user was a highly specific demographic disguised as a neutral default, locking inequity and ecological ignorance into the concrete fabric of the city. By the 1970s, postmodernism emerged as a direct, ironic rebellion against the sterile machines of the modernist era. Theorists like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown challenged modernist orthodoxy by redefining architecture as a system of cultural signs. They argued that buildings are not just functional objects, they are communicative acts that transmit ideology and memory to the public. They used the duck and the decorated shed to illustrate this. A duck expresses its meaning through its primary form, while a decorated shed is a plain structure where meaning is an applied layer of communication. Following this, the digital turn shifted the architectural epistemology from physical signs to computational parameters, moving design away from fixed geometry. Parametricism relied instead on fluid, continuous surfaces and complex relational systems. This algorithmic logic enabled extreme structural optimization, real-time data integration, and mass customization. Yet computational efficiency and smooth geometry do not ensure social equity or spatial justice. Despite the appearance of objective mathematical logic, a parametrically optimized luxury enclave can still accelerate displacement and extraction, merely masking conflict under smooth digital continuity. The Eurocentric architectural ideal is defined by the pursuit of permanence, monumentality, and the absolute geometric control of the landscape. This canon stands in sharp contrast to indigenous and non-Western traditions built on different spatial epistemologies. For example, Aboriginal Australian concepts treat architecture as an active relationship to country, a living ecosystem, rather than an act of extractive dominance. Shelters like the gunya are designed to integrate completely with the surrounding flora. These traditions often rely on temporal, cyclical architecture. Instead of fighting the environment, these structures embrace natural degradation and community-driven renewal. The Great Mosque of Janeh manifests this cycle. Its mud brick facade features projecting wooden Toron beams used as scaffolding for annual communal replastering. These structures encode advanced bioclimatic intelligence and deep environmental awareness directly into their form. Ancient builders utilized local material properties to create climate-responsive enclosures. The mortarless stone walls of Great Zimbabwe show an organic integration with the dry landscape. Vernacular architectures prove buildings can operate as responsive, living systems within a broader ecology, dismantling the myth that architecture is a fortress built against nature. We have entered the Anthropocene. Human building is now a geological force altering the planet. The global construction sector accounts for roughly a third of global energy demand and emissions. This planetary impact challenges the human-centered worldview. Designing for the user in isolation is incompatible with an era of climate instability and planetary interdependence. Look at the digital model of the glass tower again. We can visualize its existence through the water tables, microbial life, thermal energy, and wind currents passing through its boundaries. Buildings are increasingly understood as metabolic nodes embedded within ecosystems, accounting for soils, atmospheres, and non-human life. This perspective requires a shift from generic sustainability to the more urgent requirement of climate justice. A net-zero luxury development is an ethical failure if it protects wealthy enclaves while externalizing environmental risk and displacing marginalized communities. In an era of climate emergency, evaluating a building solely by its carbon profile is insufficient, unless we also evaluate its impact on spatial equity and systemic vulnerability. Architectural theory is not an abstract cloud floating above blueprints. It is the framework that dictates whose histories are centered and what futures are imaginable. The discipline requires a definition beyond placing autonomous, beautiful objects into a passive world. True spatial practice is the design of dynamic systems that organize life, power, memory, and possibility. Designers must interrogate their tools, their theories, and their inherited political biases before they draw a single line. Architecture is the primary physical technology we use to materialize the world we choose to build.